minutes before.
Right.
Found, somehow I had the picture on my phone, because it keeps me.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Paul Roth. I'm the director here at the Ryerson Image Center. And I'm really happy that all of you have come out tonight for a program that's very close to my heart. The evening that we're having, Curators in Conversation, Gordon Parks and History, is related to the exhibition that we have on view right now called Gordon Parks, the Flávio Story. We've recently spent about 4 years working on this exhibition with other institutions that partnered with us to bring it to life, specifically the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, Instituto Moreira Salles in Rio de Janeiro, and the Gordon Parks Foundation in New York. It's a transnational and Pan-American project because of the subject, which is about a particular historical moment that Gordon Parks brought about, which was also located in a geopolitical context, which has now mostly been lost to history. And we wanted to re-examine the photographs and the story surrounding them in context. But that's really just the precipitating idea for tonight. So I do want to ask if any of you haven't seen the show, please do take a look at it at another time, or if there's any time left after our program this evening. And also, my shameless plug, look at the book as well. We did a book in conjunction with the show, also called The Flávio Story. And that's available to look at or to purchase over at our front desk. But the reason why we're doing this panel tonight is because of the issues that this show brings up about Gordon Parks. And right now, I'd like to actually credit the person who said to me, this is a good idea, you should do this, because she's actually here tonight. One of our fantastic docents, the people who help our visitors here and who give tours every day in the Image Center galleries, are represented by a few of them, but also specifically Susan Devins. Susan, can you raise your hand? Susan, I was having lunch with Susan some months ago, and she asked me a question: how did you get interested in Gordon Parks? And I told her what was, I'm sure, much too long of a story about how I got interested in Gordon Parks. And when I was finished, she said, oh, you should make a program around that. And I thought it sounded, and she'll attest to this, I thought it sounded crazy. No one would be interested in this. And she said, no, people would be interested in this, and some of you apparently are interested in this, so that's good. What I told her, and what you'll see tonight, is that the way that I found out about Gordon Parks was through these two people. When I worked many, many years ago at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., one of the exhibitions that I worked on early in my tenure was a show called Half Past Autumn, The Art of Gordon Parks, which was co-curated by Philip Brookman, who you see here on your left, and here in the center, Deborah Willis. I knew Philip already. I'd worked with him on other projects, and I was his assistant at the Corcoran. I met Deborah, I think, just before the Gordon Parks show, because she was living and working in Washington, D.C. at that time, if I'm remembering correctly, at the African American Museum Project, which was at the Smithsonian, and which is now a full-fledged and very beautiful museum in Washington, D.C. And they co-organized a show that opened in 1997 that was a survey, a retrospective of Gordon Parks, not just his photography, but also things that people might have been surprised to see in a museum. We represented his music, his films. There was a film series at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, his poetry, what else?
Magazines.
Yeah, magazines and books and publications. It was a really interesting exhibition. And I was very privileged to work on that as the assistant to that show. And I want to be clear about what that means. I was the person who had to try to help do detail work. But I was really learning about him. I was not involved in the authorship of the show. That was Philip and Deb, and I watched them, and I became inspired by what they were doing. And I became inspired by their interest in Gordon, because I had to keep up with you guys. I had to read the books that they were reading and try to figure out why it is that this person was so interesting. A bit of the backstory to that is that Gordon Parks at that time was not a widely acknowledged pantheonic figure in the history of photography. He was marginalized in histories that I read when I was coming up, partly I think because he was an African American, partly also because he was a photojournalist who was considered by other photojournalists to be I remember, I won't say her name, but a famous photojournalist said to me a few years ago, wasn't Gordon Parks a Life guy? Referring in a pejorative way to Life magazine, where he worked. And although it seems unbelievable to people now, there was a time when if you worked at Life magazine, you weren't taken seriously by a whole generation of documentary and photojournalistic photographers. But what I discovered watching that show take shape from kind of a privileged position of watching it from inception to realization was I learned that Gordon Parks was an extraordinarily complex and really, really rich photographer and filmmaker and writer, a memoirist in particular, and composer, and that there were real reasons to take a new look at Gordon Parks' work. And that moment in 1997 when that exhibition opened, Gordon was alive, he was there. You guys worked with Gordon then, and you had worked with Gordon before, if I remember correctly. And so I got to see him come and participate in this celebration of his life and work. Before I show you a little bit of what that exhibition looked like, and before I introduce formally Philip and Deb, though, I do want to welcome all of you here on behalf of Ryerson University and on behalf of our partners in this evening. The School of Image Arts has generously allowed us to host this event here on this side of the glass wall that separates the school from the Ryerson Image Center, and we're very appreciative to them for letting us do that because we knew we would have too big of a crowd to sit in our great hall. So I want to thank IMA and the wonderful staff and leadership here. They are our partners in all things. I also want to thank the group band, Black Artists Network's Dialogue, represented here tonight by Karen Carter, who is head of the board. Band partnered with us before when we hosted a season of exhibitions about Black protest, and they were generous enough to co-host tonight as well because of the relationship between Gordon Parks as a historic figure and Black creativity today. So thank you very much, Karen, and to band as well. And I also would like to acknowledge that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty with the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land for future generations. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and newcomers alike, have all been invited into this treaty into the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So thank you again for being here. Before I introduce Deb and Philip with their biographies, I want to quickly show you the sort of anchoring event that I just spoke about, Half Past Autumn. Half Past Autumn was shown in 1997 at the Corcoran Gallery of Art. This is a contemporary image of the fantastic Beaux-Arts building that hosted the Corcoran. The Corcoran is sadly no longer a museum. That building does still host the Corcoran College of Art and Design, which is now part of George Washington University. The Corcoran had been a museum that had been around so long that Gordon Parks very likely walked into the halls of the Corcoran when he arrived in Washington, D.C. in the early 1940s to work at the Farm Security Administration. And here's the oldest image that I have of it from the mid-1950s, I believe, or the early 1960s. In the mid-1990s, the building was a bit of a big heap, a fantastic work of architecture, but in many ways, kind of a fading building. But it was still a very grand space, and it made a wonderful setting for this very large survey exhibition. You can see here actually at the introduction that this space right here that you see in the image on the left is where the exhibition could be seen. People would come up a grand staircase and see right in front of them this exhibition and be introduced to Gordon's work. There had only been a small number of surveys that addressed Gordon's work, and I think there was never anything this large or substantial representing his photography to this date. Is that fair? It was the biggest show of his work to that time.
Probably. I know Deb did a show
At the
in New York.
At the New York
Public Library. That was
It was pretty
extensive
expensive,
exhibition.
yeah.
Okay.
You could describe that a little bit as we go on, but
Yes.
Yeah.
it's certainly the predecessor to this one.
Yeah,
You know, and then also exhibitions in Kansas.
right.
Uh,
Yeah.
But this is an exhibition that he considered to be like, you know, sort of the retrospective, you know, the final retrospective exhibition.
And it was the final retrospective that he worked on while he was alive. He went on to write another memoir, actually, so he was not done telling his own story. This show was amazing to work on for a variety of reasons, and I can't go into it too deeply, but I will tell you that in my time at the Corcoran, I was there 16 years, this was the most funding we ever had for an exhibition.
Really?
Because it was sponsored by Time Warner and by Ford Motor Company. And they had money, and they gave us some. And one little behind the scenes story, this show toured for over 20 venues. And for the first several of those venues, the Ford Motor Company and Time Warner fought over whose logo would be bigger on the walls of the opening. I remember it well. This exhibition treated Gordon's work from what we thought at that time were the earliest works that could be found, that we really could easily get at, all the way to work that Gordon was doing at that present moment in the late 1990s. We included his music. You're actually looking at a kind of a listening station with 3 pages of a musical score by Gordon, and you could put the headphones on and listen to his music. At that time, it was not remembered by a lot of people that Gordon was a very accomplished composer. We incorporated books and magazines in the show at various intervals to give context to how the photographs had originally been published. We showed black and white and color work. Philip and Deb had found a lot of the original color material, and we had new prints made under Gordon's supervision to represent those photographs. The work that was on view was not just the photojournalism that Gordon is especially celebrated for now, but also kind of emblematic single color photographs that he published to great popular acclaim in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Often accompanied by his poems. And those photographs are actually not much remembered right now, but some of them are quite extraordinary. And we showed a documentary about Gordon called Moments Without Proper Names. And the later photographs were represented by about, my memory is about 30 of his latest photographs. And my very clear memory is that there were 235 photographs in the show. And I remember that because I had to send out the checklist to over 20 traveling venues for the next several years. I think it finally came off the road in the 2001, something like that. It was on the road a long time. Philip shrugs because he did a lot of shows between the beginning and the end. It was a great experience, as I said. And it was an experience as well, and I have no photos of it here, but it was an experience as well to see Gordon at the opening and to see him recognized by a new generation. One of the dominant memories in my mind is of Gordon. I believe I have this very, very vague memory that he had just had a ski injury or something like that, and he was in a what was it, tennis? A tennis injury, and he was in a wheelchair, and he was rolled onto a stage. We had arranged for one or more classes at a local school to read his book, A Choice of Weapons, which is his first memoir, and some say his best memoir, a wonderful, wonderful book. And when Gordon was rolled on stage, he stood up out of the wheelchair and and did something with his hands, like he lifted his hands over his head like he was a superstar. And I had never seen a photographer do that in my life. And the kids actually burst into applause and stood up and started shouting. And I thought that was incredible. They had just read a book about this person's youth, because that's really what that book is mostly about. It's about his childhood and his coming of age. And they were inspired by it, and then they were inspired by seeing him alive and on stage. And owning his own place in history. And that's what brings us to tonight. There have been a lot of Gordon Parks projects in recent years. This is the latest one, but they are by no means at an end. And another reason that I wanted Philip and Deb here, beyond the fact that they organized that retrospective all those years ago, over 20 years ago now, is that they're both working on a new Gordon Parks project, and it's the next one. It's the one that will open very, very soon after this one. In fact, this one will still be on view when the exhibition Gordon Parks, The New Tide, Early Work, 1940 to 1950, opens in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery of Art. And that exhibition is curated by Philip, and Deb wrote an essay for the catalog. So they are reunited around Gordon again. And it happened to coincide with the timing of this exhibition. So it seemed like a good occasion to sit together and to talk about their project coming up, what they have discovered, because I can tell you I've seen a PDF of the catalog, and it is absolutely transformative of scholarship on Gordon Parks. It will change the way people think about him forever.
Okay.
It's really
I said,
great.
I want to see the PDF.
Exactly. You know, I pulled some strings. I wanted to see it that bad. It's such a great thing, the book. I can tell you now, even though the show isn't even up on the wall yet, that you should, if you can, go to Washington between November 1st when it opens and
November 4th
4th.
to February 18th, 2019.
You should go and see that show if you want to know about the origins of Gordon Parks. But also, I thought, who better to talk about why it is that Gordon Parks is so persistent in history, why he is so important to today's generations, and how it is that this person somehow becomes a richer and richer subject of study, even now, even after so many projects have unfolded in the last few years. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Deborah Willis, and about Philip Brookman, and then Philip will take us through a little bit about the show, and Deb will talk a little bit about her essay and her subject of study around Gordon Parks, both of which will give you a sense of the context that will prevail in their project. Deborah has a long biography, and I'm going to read some of it to you because I want people to understand, and this is true of both of them, these people have done a lot of amazing things. They're both pretty modest in my experience. I never hear either one of them toot their own horn, so I'm going to do that for them. Deborah Willis, PhD, is a university professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of Arts in New York University. And she has just, I think, been appointed chair, correct me if I'm wrong, of the College of Arts and Sciences Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, Africana Studies. That's as of this school year. And there she teaches courses on photography and imaging, iconicity, and cultural histories visualizing the Black body, women, and gender. Her research examines photography's multifaceted histories, visual culture, the photographic history of slavery and emancipation, contemporary women photographers, and repeatedly throughout her career, the subject of beauty. She has received the very prestigious John D. and Catherine MacArthur Fellowship, sometimes known as a Genius Grant. I still remember how excited I was when I read her name in the paper that day, and John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship as well. She is the author of too many books to name, but some of the really prominent ones are Posing Beauty, African American Images from the 1890s to the Present. She is the co-author of The Black Female Body, A Photographic History, Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, and Michelle Obama, the First Lady in Photographs. I also remember seeing that book on a shelf, picking it up and finding out it was by Deb. And both of those last two titles were winners of the NAACP Image Award. Her curated exhibitions include In Pursuit of Beauty at Express Newark, Let Your Motto Be Resistance, African American Portraits at ICP in New York, and Reframing Beauty, Intimate Moments at Indiana University. Since 2006, she has co-organized thematic conferences exploring imaging of the Black body in the West, and in particular and most prominently, the now legendary Black Portraitures conferences, which have been held all over. And I think there's a new one coming up, correct? Yes. This fall?
October 2019.
2019, next fall. She has appeared and consulted on media projects, including documentary films such as Through a Lens Darkly and Question Bridge Black Males, and also the great PBS multi-part documentary, American Photography. I think it's fair to say that few, if any, people have done more to recognize and to study the history of Black photography than Deb Willis. So we're very happy to have you here. Thanks for coming, Deb. And I'm also going to tell you that Deb is going to be back here on Saturday. And she really is going back to New York and then coming back on Saturday. She's actually going to be giving a talk at Gallery 44 called Critical Narratives in Visualizing the Black Body in Photography and Popular Culture. And that will be held at Gallery 44 at 401 Richmond Street West, Saturday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. So please consider going to that as well. Philip used to be my boss for many years. I worked with him for over almost a quarter century in two different places, at the National Gallery and at the Corcoran Gallery of Art. And he is presently consulting curator in the Department of Photographs at the NGA in Washington, D.C. In addition to Gordon Parks, The New Tide, early work 1940 to 1950, he recently curated for the NGA Intersections, photographs and videos from the National Gallery of Art and the Corcoran Gallery of Art, bringing together the two photography collections. For many years, he was chief curator and head of research, and before that, senior curator of photography and media arts at the Corcoran between 1993 and 2014. And there, he organized and co-organized many projects, including exhibitions on Edward Muybridge, Terence Simon, Hank Willis Thomas, Sally Mann, Robert Frank, Gordon, of course, Jim Goldberg, Gilles Perez, Larry Sultan, and Danny Lyon. He essentially oversaw development and the recreation of the Corcoran's photography and media collections and exhibitions program, and he curated the Corcoran Biennial exhibition in the year 2000. He has also organized and co-organized exhibitions for Tate Modern and the Museum of Arts in Houston, and prior to the Corcoran, held curatorial positions at Washington Project for the Arts, Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, and the University of California, Santa Cruz between 1977 and 1992. He's also a photographer, and in 2015 published a book of his own photography with a fiction, a work of fiction accompanying the photographs, a book called Redlands, which is wonderful, published by Steidl. Please seek that out. I also want to say that Philip Brookman, for those of you interested in Robert Frank, Philip is the key curator of Robert Frank's photographs. He did 5 exhibitions with Robert, and for many years, Robert wanted as much as he possibly could to work with Philip whenever a show was done. Thank you, Philip, for coming. Appreciate it. And now I'm going to pass the wand, the magic wand, over to Philip, who's going to tell you about The New Tide.
Okay, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, no more, right? And tonight, Paul is my boss, and so he is going to yank me off the stage after 10 minutes if I go that long. So I think what I wanted to say is really, there are 2 things. How I came to Gordon Parks, and and then how I've come back to Gordon Parks so many years later. When I was in high school, 15 years old, I was, taking a photography class, which was like an art requirement, I guess. And I was really interested in, the sort of photography of the time, of the 70s, 60s. But my photography teacher gave me a copy of Gordon Parks' book, A Choice of Weapons, his memoir. And this would have been not long after that book was published. It would have been in probably 1969 or 1970, so it's close to the time the book was written. And she said, here, I think you might like this. And it's a small paperback book, I suppose, at the time. And I read it, and it completely changed my idea of what photography was. It wasn't only taking pictures of what's happening around you, or taking pictures of the landscape or the clouds, but it was what I learned then was that it was really about making pictures that had meaning in the world and had some meaning related to the social, political, and cultural scene. Really, that's what I got from it. And the book doesn't have any of Gordon Parks' photographs in it. It's simply a story that he wrote, Choice of Weapon, about how he himself came to photography from a background of, growing up poor in a segregated community in Fort Scott, Kansas, in the he was born in 1912, and in the 1920s and 30s, and then what happened to him and how he got to the point where he discovered photography, and then how he learned photography. That's really what this book is about. So it sort of takes you from, the time his mother dies in 1928 until really when he goes to Washington and the work he does in Washington, D.C., which is 1942, 1943. So it's just the beginning part. So for me, that was a critical moment in my own coming of age, I guess, that I discovered, the story of Gordon Parks. And that was what he was trying to do with that book. He wanted his life story to be a kind of critical, opening up of the world to young people. I don't know how my teacher thought I would be interested in this, but it was also a time during the Vietnam War when people were being asked to pick up weapons and fight. And for Gordon Parks, the camera was his weapon. And that's, that metaphor was something that, really transformed my idea about photography. So then flash forward to about 5 years ago, I guess, 4 years ago, when I started working on this new project, which is called Gordon Parks, The New Tide. And the reason I want to talk about this first before Half Past Autumn is that I find that today, 4 years ago, almost all of the scholarship about Gordon Parks and his photography is rooted in these memoirs, things that he wrote about himself. I think that's true, that most people take a series of memoirs that Gordon Parks wrote, and they use that as the roots of, all the scholarship that we're gonna see from, the 70s, 80s, 90s, as long as people have been writing about this work. And I started to wonder, sort of what's missing from those. I knew that there were parts of his books that were just not right, and I had talked to him about that. But I started to think about really what was missing about, sort of how did Gordon Parks really come to photography, and how did he get there? He was self-taught, how did he become the person that he was, which when I met him, he was 82 or 3 years old, and he was, that superstar that held up his hand. So that's how I came to think about, like revisiting this, what we know about Gordon Parks. So what I knew about Gordon Parks at that time was, again, basically, working with Gordon Parks. It was about organizing a retrospective exhibition of his photography and films that we started working on in probably 1996. And I came to that because it wasn't really my idea. And at the time, I was really immersed in, lots of things, especially related to documentary photography. But, we got a call at the Corcoran Gallery of Art from, I think, from the publisher of a new book that Gordon Parks was working on. And it was called Half Past Autumn, basically another memoir that Gordon was writing, and he had a lot of photographs in at this time, another memoir. And they wanted to have an exhibition that would accompany the book. And so they asked the Corcoran if we would do it. And I jumped at the idea, and I said, yes, I think that'd be interesting. We set up a meeting, and I went to New York and met with Gordon and this whole group of people around an enormous conference table at Time Warner, which still existed at that time. And, that was the genesis of Half Past Autumn. So I jumped into it. And so this photograph is something I just found. This is a picture of Gordon Parks on the right, and on the left is Terry Hackford, who was the editor working for Bullfinch Press, the publisher, and then me. And what struck me about this is that we were still, in doing this project, usually when a museum takes on a retrospective exhibition, you want to redefine the scholarship and all this. And, basically, what struck me about this is that we're looking to Gordon at this time for, again, for guidance about his story. What is it we should do? And he would tell us, and he was really, directing the project, as he always did with his work. And you must have experienced this in the 70s. And so, I learned so much working with him, but at the same time, as a curator, we always think that we know best and we know what are the best works. But, Gordon would say, no, that's not right. This is what I think. And he was always right. The truth was he was always right about it. And so, we worked very closely with him to do the exhibition. And, that's how I learned who he was. And when I first proposed to work with him, what I said to him was that I wanted to do an exhibition that would, in a sense, be an autobiography. It would follow the same, structure and rules of the memoirs. It would be his autobiography based on, how he had seen his life. And he said, that's how I always use my photography. And he loved that idea. And so that's how we structured the show. And I thought about it. And so he was guiding all of us all this time in how to see his work and his vision and his story. And I remember I asked him two questions that baffled me at the time. One was the well-known photograph of the government charwoman that he called American Gothic, photograph of a woman in front of an American flag. He always said that it was photographed in January, right after he came to Washington, January of 1942. But it's clear from the photograph and also from other captions that the Library of Congress had that it was shot in the summer. It looks like it's summer. And I said, you say this was January. I think it's August, July or August. What do you think? And he had this kind of sly smile, and he said, you're probably right. And then I asked him, what happened to the negatives for the earliest photographs that you made he had written about making photographs in St. Paul, Minnesota, and in Chicago. And what happened to those negatives? Where are they? Because none of us had seen the pictures. I mean, they didn't exist. He never published them. Very, very rarely. There were just 2 or 3 pictures. He really saw the beginning of his professional career started when he moved to Washington and worked for the Farm Security Administration. And then he said, I lost them or I threw them out. I didn't know what they were. And I didn't believe that for a minute, that he didn't know what his negatives were. I mean, he left them behind, is really what I've learned. He didn't really care about that work once he got started professionally. For him, it was like a student being a student. And for me as a curator, this was really a kind of transformative moment in understanding who he was. He established his retrospective story, and he stuck with it for many, many years. And so I thought then recently, we should go back. I mean, Gordon he died in 2006, and I thought we should go back and really do the research and see what, how did he get to where he was? Where are those pictures? Can we find them? And so I proposed to the National Gallery of Art to organize an exhibition of Gordon Parks' early work, the first decade of his photography, beginning in 1940, when he was working professionally as a photographer, and then ending in 1950 when he had just been appointed the first African-American staff photographer at Life magazine. So it's that first decade. And so that's the project then. So on the left is I'll go very quickly through this now, the cover of the exhibition catalog for Half Past Autumn. And of course, Gordon is there, front and center, a picture of him in front of one of his most recent photographs, looking for all the world like he's ascending into the sky at that point. And then on the right is the cover for our new book, Gordon Parks, The New Tide. And it's a portrait of Langston Hughes that Parks made in December of 1941. And so going back, I was most interested in the, kind of rooting out and uncovering all the context and connections that would have influenced who Parks was and how he came to photography, and then how he came to be the photographer he was when he went to Life magazine in 1948, 49. And so, I mean, who was he really? And it was not an easy story to really find, and the clues that we had starting out were the memoirs, were the things that Gordon Parks had written, his photographs, and then, sort of all the kind of people we knew he was around, and, friends. And, it was almost too late to come to this project. Almost everybody was gone. Gordon was gone. We couldn't ask him. And if we did, I don't know that he would have told him. He may have at that point, but so also the Gordon Parks Foundation was an amazing resource because he had left, like a large group of photographs and context sheets and negatives, and then papers that are now at the University of Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas. So all that was a huge help. So for me, it was like a giant research project, and one that I couldn't have done at the Corcoran. We didn't have the resources to work for 4 years on a project and travel constantly to, visit archives and, really work on it the way that we had to. So I'm just going to quickly show you little bits I'm not going to show you so much the photographs, but the context. On the left is a photograph of Gordon Parks' mother, made in probably 1885, about 1885, after she had come to Kansas from Tennessee, before she was married to Gordon Parks' father. I also learned that Gordon Parks was the youngest of 15 children. And one of the things he never mentions is that his father had 5 of those children were from his first wife, Anna, who died, and then he married Sarah Ross, who becomes Sarah Parks, and then the next 10 children, the last of which was Gordon, are from Sarah. So this is a photograph we found, and it was in a photo album that his daughter had received after he died. And he had never shown or mentioned this photograph. And then the picture on the right is Gordon Parks in Minneapolis or St. Paul. I think it's Minneapolis. You know, as a kind of dapper young guy, he wanted to be a musician. And this is really before he becomes a photographer. One of the things that we published, we established an extensive timeline of Gordon Parks, his origins, his great-grandparents were born into slavery. We found where they came from, the South, from New Orleans, from Tennessee to Kansas, you know, all the context around that, and then the family, his brothers and sisters, who they were. On the left is a portrait of his older brother, Clemmy Parks, who was, I think, one of Gordon's major inspirations. Here he's in the military. He was an officer in the U.S. Army during World War I. And then, so this timeline goes from like 1823 through 1950, the end. And so we have a lot of new discoveries established there that are all kind of laid out, and they're also laid out in the essays that are in the book. So Gordon talked about working for the railroad. He found his first camera, or he found his first, you know, kind of interest in photography in, you know, while he was working for the Northern Pacific Railway Company as a waiter in the dining cars. He would travel back and forth between Chicago and Seattle, working as a waiter, and he found magazines either left behind or given to him, depending on which version of the memoirs you read. They're different. And so in a magazine, he describes finding images of the Depression. Maybe he describes Farm Security Administration images that he saw, and that led him to understand that photography could be something he could use to describe who he was and what he had experienced. And in that way, he could help to, you know, bring about a more equal and just world, which was different than the world he came from and he lived in at the time. So I went and found his first application. This is just one example of the research. His first application for employment for the Northern Pacific Railway Company, which was there in the Minnesota Historical Society, which has the archives of the Northern Pacific Railway Company. And you know, you learn so much from these things about his previous jobs, about you know, his family, who he supported, what his salary was, all this stuff. And then Parks, you know, he gets his first camera in Seattle. He describes he bought it in a pawn shop. It cost either $7.50 or $12 or something like that. Again, depending on which story. And he taught himself to use it. He began making photographs in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he very quickly became very good at it. He was so interested. And the kind of pictures he was making were primarily portraits and sort of, glamour pictures of people he knew. He started to, he was earning money, he had a family, he was married, had one son at that time in the 30s. And then on the right, you can see where he advertises his photography studio, which he established in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he says, for the lovely photographic studies that render individual personalities. Well, this is very different than the pictures he says he's making. So what are these pictures? We had to find the magazines and the newspapers. A lot of his early work was published in the African-American papers of St. Paul and Minneapolis. On the left, you can see he photographed an exhibit at the Festival of Nations. He was their official photographer. And you can see it says at the bottom, describes this exhibition, and it says photographic studies were done by Gordon Parks, St. Paul photographer. He was well known around town by this time. And one of the photographs you see in the picture on the left, those are Parks' photographs on the very right, is this one here, which was also published, it's a picture on the right, it's also published in the St. Paul Recorder and Minneapolis Statesman. He won an award at the American Negro Exposition in 1940, a very famous, well-known expo that took place in Chicago. And as a result of that award, he, the St. Paul Pioneer Press published an article about him. And here you see some of his early photographs. These are all pictures made in 1940, maybe 1939, and prints of them don't exist anymore. These are the pictures I wondered about. Where are these pictures? We found some in the newspapers. And then Gordon Parks moves to Chicago. He is encouraged through the fashion work he's been doing to move to Chicago. He's offered a studio at the Southside Community Art Center, which was a new, just opened community art center funded by the government. It opened in end of 1940, and Parks was there at the beginning, and the people he was around there transformed his idea about art. Before this, he was making photographs that were essentially portraits and kind of glamour pictures and fashion pictures. And he moved to Chicago, and he's around artists like Charles White. You see the portrait of Charles White on the right, and philosopher, educator Alain Locke, you see on the left. Here's a new self-portrait that Parks made of himself in 1941. It was really to help publicize his exhibition at the Art Center. And then the portrait of Langston Hughes. So Parks is around people like Charles White, Langston Hughes, Algier Couture, Richard Wright, the writer, author, a number of very important artists in Chicago really had fomented, an important new African-American art movement between late 30s and mid 1940s in Chicago. And Parks is in the middle of that. And that's what transforms his vision. Not other photographers, but the painters especially really helped him understand what he should be looking at. So he should be looking at the streets, what's outside. The photograph on the right is a young boy, a picture of a young boy. He called it Cornered. It's in Chicago, probably made in 1942. And then on the left is the application for his Julius Rosenwald Fellowship, the fellowship that then gave him funding to move to Washington, D.C., to work for the Farm Security Administration, a federal agency that was really just ending at the time Parks went there. So why did they want Gordon Parks to come to Washington? They wanted him to be able to make photographs that would help to encourage African Americans to support what is going on in the world in 1942. And he arrives there in May 1942, World War II. And for historians now looking back, it's a critical moment in the history of the American civil rights movement. World War II was a very fraught moment where there were a lot of protests in the United States because the military was segregated, the country was still segregated, but black people were being asked to support the war effort. And the government knew that without that, it would be more difficult to win the war. So there was a big effort to get people to support the war effort. Parks made photographs like the one you see on the left, of a new public housing project that would show how life was getting better. It may not be good, it's still segregated, but life's getting better. Segregated public housing in Washington, D.C. A picture that could have been published in Good Housekeeping. I don't know if they had that at the time, but it could have been. Very carefully constructed picture that's not unlike photographs Parks had been making in Chicago and Minneapolis, St. Paul before. And at the same time, he's making photographs like the one you see on the right. He met the cleaning woman that cleaned the offices in the Department of Agriculture building that housed the Farm Security Administration. And he photographed her, Ella Watson, with her broom and mop standing in front of the American flag. Parks went to Washington with the idea that he could fight discrimination, fight bigotry with his camera. He had to learn how to do that. He didn't really understand how to make the kind of pictures that would effectively do what he wanted. And at the same time, images like the one you see on the left, this is the end of June 1942, made a month before the picture on the right. The cover of Life magazine shows the USO Victory Bell, beautiful white woman, on the cover of Life magazine in front of the American flag. And so Parks subverts this image. He takes it and he poses a woman who was unable to advance in her job or earn more money to help support her own family because the government employment system was segregated because she was black. Pictures like the one you saw on the left of the woman looking out the window at her children are published then in an Office of War Information pamphlet called Negroes in the War. This image on your left shows a man in Harlem reading Negroes in the War. Pictures on the right, pictures like the one you saw on the right of Ella Watson were put away. They were never shown by the Office of War Information or the Farm Security Administration. In fact, this photograph was never published until it was published in Ebony in 1948. And then Parks also photographed, he did jobs for the Office of War Information. He photographed Tuskegee Airmen. He insisted he really wanted to go with the black fighter pilots to Europe with them. He wasn't allowed to because the government did not want to publicize black people in combat. And because he wasn't allowed to go with his friends he had made into combat, he quit the government, moved to New York, and then began working a series of jobs. By this time, he had the training to do very significant photographic documentary work, industrial work. He was hired by Roy Stryker, who had brought him originally to the Farm Security Administration to work for Standard Oil Company in New Jersey. This image shows Gordon going out on a job for Standard Oil with all his cameras and lights and flash equipment and all of that. And then through the rest of the 1940s, between 1944 and 1950, he advances his career just meteorically. It's quite amazing what he does, and makes photographs for a number of media publications, including Glamour, a small magazine called Circuit Smart Woman, which Deb will talk about in a minute, and then Life magazine. And he's working with people, friends of his, like Ralph Ellison, to basically document the impact of segregation on people's lives. He's able to finally then use his camera as a weapon, his choice of weapons as he described initially. I'm going to stop there and then turn it over to my colleague here.
Okay, great, thank you. How many people here knew Gordon Parks' work before on this exhibition? Great, great. Were you introduced to him as in the magazine, hands, in exhibitions? Okay, great. So I was introduced to Gordon when I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up in the beauty shop. My mom had a beauty shop. I spent, my mother went to school in the 50s. So I spent my entire life sitting on the floor in her beauty shop looking at Life, Look, Ebony, and Jet. They were the central visual experiences for us. Jet was quick and fast and easy. Ebony was beautiful stories, and the same with Look and Life. But Life captured my imagination because of Gordon. I remember my father, pointing out, this is a Black photographer, this is what he's photographing, and he pointed out the stories. And I remember the moments that captured my imagination about wanting to become a photographer. And it happened when I was a young girl. And it happened because of Langston Hughes's book, The Sweet Flypaper of Life, and then also because of Gordon. So I met, same 1969, I read the Choice of Weapons. I've visually read Sweet Flypaper of Life when I was about 7 or 8 years old. But in '69, I read The Choice of Weapons, and it transformed my life. And then I saw The Learning Tree. And to see his first film and his first book within a short period of time, I began to think about how this man who could tell a story about life in the Midwest, and for a young girl growing up in Philadelphia. I went to art school, studied at the Philadelphia College of Art, studied photography, and in 1972, and none of my history books had Black photographers. And I asked one of my professors, where are the Black photographers? Just like you, in terms of where, I knew of Gordon, I knew of Moneta Sleet, who was in Ebony magazine, so I knew of Black photographers working. I knew photographers in the city of Philadelphia as journalists. And she suggested, why not do a research project, which was supposed to be for 1 year. It ended up 40 years later, I'm still doing the same research project. And I was able to find Gordon's address in 1973. I wrote him a letter, and he responded. And it's just amazing. I had a list of photographers I wanted to meet, and he responded just within a short period of time. It was summer, it was June, and he invited me. I told him my research project. I told him when I first heard of him and I wanted to meet him. And he wrote back and says, "Dear Debbie," I'll never forget it. Just, please come up and visit anytime. And he lived at the UN Plaza, and I actually took a train to New York, and just as innocent as I could be and loving every moment of it. And he was generous. He listened to my story. He told me his story. He invited me to use some of the photographs in my for my research project. And then he just stayed in my life. After I finished school, I went to graduate school in New York. He was constantly reaching out and calling back, and I felt I was a part of his community. And in 1980, I started working at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And one of the first projects that I had was, I was researching on Black photographers in 1972 to 75 at the Schomburg, looking for their photographs, looking for Gordon's photographs. But the Schomburg had it filed A to Z. Everything was A to Z. Faces, street scenes, buildings. And when I got there, I said, first thing I'm going to do is unwrap, unpile, refile all the photographs. And then there were 4 boxes of photographs from the Farm Security Administration on the top of a box, on the top of a cabinet, dusty, dirty, and they were all Gordon's photographs. And it was amazing. And that was the first collection I processed.
They're still dirty.
And they're still dirty. I dusted. I used I had my little preservation kit and what light impressions was my gloves, and I was really happy about it. And I told Gordon, he was excited about that collection was there. So one of the things I did was put together a small exhibition about his photographs. So I just wanted to just show some of the stories when Paul invited us to share moments of Gordon's. And this photograph just really excited me. He always talked about Paris in his writings and talked about the experience of entering Paris. But to see it imagined in this photograph, I don't know how it was constructed. I don't know who made the photograph. But he knew that this was a moment that needed to be documented. With his children, it's about celebration. We see the balloons, and look who's behind the wheel, Sally, and his three children. And this is a central image for me to think about Gordon. Also, the photograph of his mother, Sarah Parks, and the way that it's preserved. To think about family was central to him, taking his family to Europe, but also preserving his mother's photograph. I'm not sure how it circulated throughout the family, but you can see, I believe that this is like I believe that his first fashion moment, looking at his mother as a fashionable lady, not as a mother, a worker, but someone who is stylized for the moment with her dress, and she's in the photographic studio. And one of the experiences that I had in living in Washington, I knew a lot of the older photographers, and one was Robert McNeil. And he talked about Gordon. He says, I saw Gordon Parks photographing on Howard University's campus. He was on his knees. He said, I never noticed photographers move around that much. They stand up, they take photographs, but Gordon took unusual angles. And he was fascinated with that. So when I see Gordon in these unusual angles that he's documenting Charles White in front of his mural, but also what he's using, looking at Charles White as a painter, but also reflecting on the histories that Charles White is creating about Black America. And Charles White's show is opening at MoMA next month. But also Smart Woman magazine. His wife was also a designer. She designed hats. She modeled for him. And so this is an issue that he was the photo editor for. And we can see how he's creating the Christmas issue, but he's also creating the desire for women to buy not only hats, but presents for the Christmas. So we think about the narrative that he's creating at the time. We also see her posed here. This is Sally, as she's posing in front of, probably in their home, but she's wearing the scarf, and to see how he could reflect what other women would like to experience. And we talked about this image, but also the image of Ella at home. And one of another important moments that I found in Gordon's work are mirrors. He followed many people through the reflection of their lives through mirrors. I think mirrors a central device for him in breaking up a plane, understanding the story and giving reflection on the moment of a woman sitting on the bed, respecting FDR in terms of the president, but also looking at the walls, looking how she designed her home and what's precious on her walls. This is a photograph of Mordecai Johnson, who was the president of Howard University. As opposed to photographing the table, he's photographing the mirror and the young person who's working there. He's also looking at women and taking care of the women and the stories that, in terms of healthcare. You see the calendars are central. We see calendars as art. We see art on the wall, but we also see the lamps and also kind of medicinal experiences that they're working through. Again, mirrors in the back, family, foreground, middle ground, and background is central to his stories. Looking again from the behind through a shoulder. This is on 7th Street in Washington, D.C., outside of a hat shop, and just a kind of a man in a dandy looking hat. Photographing men at work, from construction workers to Duke Ellington, and another unusual angle, but also looking at the knowing that Duke was fashionably dressed all the time, and look at his ties and how his ties were placed on the chair, and how his Ellingtonian, his sheet music is there. So they're kind of constructing a story about the man. Sugar Ray Robinson on the golf course to Marian Anderson. So we begin to see his central way of moving through. He's in DC, he's in New York, 2 young kids walking to school out from the subway. And then this important doll test, when thinking about how do you tell a story about desire, about neglect, about isolation. He was hired and he photographed this, and this was in Ebony magazine. There were 5 different images, but we can see the complex moment when the child was asked, give me the doll that looks like you, the best doll, the prettiest doll, the doll that you desire. And the child is looking at the black doll, but also reaching for the white doll. So we see this whole aspect of how this test worked and how Gordon was central in making it successful by documenting it. Also in Harlem, this is Adam Clayton Powell's newspaper, The Voice, posters on the backdrop, and some of these young boys worked as newsboys. So the press is important. As I've mentioned before, he's documenting men at work, the union, the bartenders union, a woman just, casually coming home and looking at the streets with her dog, her companion. And so we see Harlem through his lens, the lens of a gang leader who's frightened, who's looking, one who's also central reading the paper, but also the isolation of that experience of going home alone after a interview to talk about his experience as a gang leader. But the style that Gordon was able to document, you can feel the loneliness in the image, but you can also see the style of dress of this young man who is a leader in his community. In terms of his fashion, we see the posing and the framing of the image, from the inside looking at a photographer making an image, to the construction of the image, to how he can imagine women would like to have, these jackets. Like he's placing everyday women on the streets, and that these women who are reading the magazines can see themselves, reflections in these stylized clothes. So he understood how women felt about fashion in New York and in Paris, placed on the streets and as well as in the magazines. Here is a roundabout, a merry-go-round, you know, the playfulness of two models with their, you know, leisure clothes, to a photographer photographing one of his most noted models that he photographed most of the time, Bettina, I think, right? That he photographed her. And the way that he's able to document this, we are experiencing not only the photographer photographing the model, but also the model as we're passing by. So it's like an experiential moment as we look at his work. And then also selecting an image, you know, how he crops, what it's seen, if he's working with the editor, and what stories told through the images. The playfulness of his work and during this time period. Didn't even know about these images until we were working on this project. And this is another one, you know, very complex image, you know, women in shoes. But look, 4 different pairs of shoes, you know, 2 legs, and trying to figure out, well, where are 4 legs, shoes? So how's he playing with these styles within framing this? And it's another way of how Gordon is able to create a narrative. Another one with Muhammad Ali and the mirror assessing himself, and Muhammad Ali as he's, again, this is an experience that Gordon is documenting. He's looking at Muhammad Ali driving in Miami, and he's in another car. So we begin to see how he is living the life of a photographer, but also giving the reader an opportunity to see what he's experiencing with, you know, Eartha Kitt, you know, about to perform, and also having a seamstress hem her dress. So these are moments that I see Gordon from Chicago, at Chicago church, with a minister, to images of Ralph Ellison and the Invisible Man. And so we think about how Gordon is using images, and I think there's another one there, yeah, just to kind of go through some of the segregation images that he documented in Alabama. How he entered in homes and became a family member, looking at people who were discriminated against in terms of colored signs and white-only signs, and how families had to protect others in the home. And the experience of religion with the Nation of Islam, and photographing the women and the men, the power of voice of Malcolm X. We see the flag in the front. So it's about citizenship, and he's understanding that and framing the idea of citizenship through these images. So I wanted to end with that and kind of open up.
Thank you, Philip and Deb. I was struck watching what you were showing, the complexity of his career, which is, for me, what's been the great discovery in the years since 1997 and half past autumn, but particularly in the last several years since Gordon passed away. Because there has been, some of you may know this directly, some of you may not know, there have been a number of projects examining Gordon's career, usually by focusing on a single body of work. Most of the projects until now, including the one that we're showing here at the RIC, have taken a single body of work that he's done and looked at it really closely. And for me, this has been kind of an overpowering experience to see the books that have been published. I've seen many of the shows that have come out. And the reason why it's been overpowering is because I find with each one of these exhibitions and books that there is so much more to this person than I ever knew. And I just heard you guys say the same thing. There's so much that you learned working on this project that you didn't know from before. And I find that tremendously exciting. But I also find it wonderful because his work and his life are worthy of all of this. It's incredible to me that somebody can be looked at so carefully in such a granular way by so many different people, historians and curators, over as many years now as it has been since Gordon passed away in 2006. And I can speak for myself, I'm not even remotely exhausted by what I'm seeing. I'm excited by it. And as I said earlier, the project that you guys are working on right now is, for me, the most exciting one that I've seen come out of this series of examinations, because you guys are giving a context that did not exist before. You're not looking at something that's known, you're looking at something that really was unknown. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about how it is that you think this idea of context, of setting Gordon in context, which is something that, strangely to me, did not really exist until quite recently. How it is that context is going to help people understand Gordon's work.
Well, I mean, the context did exist before, but it was Gordon who set the context. I mean, he really, established the narrative that we all understood and knew, for the most part. And I mean, that's why I think, a lot of this new scholarship is so important right now. I mean, going back and examining, what was it that impacted on his life, I mean, in the 1920s and 1930s, that led him to, have this, really strong interest in photography when he started out, that just, I mean, how many photographers do we know that, were that driven, that propelled themselves to such excellence so quickly? And so I just think, the context now, it's important to understand, not only what the real stories are, which, we'll never really know. But, going back in old newspaper articles, and, we find out more and more about, who he was and what he was doing. And, I just think the time that when Parks begins as a photographer, which is effectively 1938, it's such an interesting time in American history, between, the sort of the end of the Depression era and through the 1940s. It's really interesting in terms of the transformation of the culture. I mean, in 1938, the United States was effectively completely segregated still. And in 1950, I mean, there were cracks in that wall, which Parks was involved in helping to create.
But also, in terms of context, it's about citizenship. And he was able to identify stories about citizenship throughout, that there were segregated communities that thrived, and he documented that with the St. Paul images. He's looking at personalities and individuals. So he is finding not only their voices, but he's giving their presence a kind of a stability within the press, within their own homes. And so I really think that he's placing not only political images, but cultural images, and telling that context, creating that context of who we are as individuals and as Americans, black and white, as he walked through these images.
Well, Gordon's earliest work is about a community, a kind of middle class, upper middle class community in Rondo, St. Paul, Minnesota, which was a thriving community then, and that's what he documented. He photographed the people and published them in the newspaper, making portraits. So he started out with that idea that the community was, was maybe the central core. I think that's a really good point. And, what it comes to is that, he understood, maybe seeing the magazine on the train, that African Americans had very little control over their own image in 1938 or 1940, and that if he could be a photographer, he could begin to change that equation in some way. And by the end of the 1940s, he did do that. He took more control and was able to to bring that about. And and then the example he set really inspired so many others in following. I mean, it inspired you, and it inspired a lot of the work that we're only just beginning to see now.
Yeah.
So
one thing that's really struck me over these last number of projects, one at the MFA Boston, another one at the High Museum, another one at the New Orleans Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem. Looking at these projects, one of the things that struck me is that now he's really an iconic figure. And in his lifetime, he was an iconic figure. He was a very famous man. Sometimes now I think it's hard for people to imagine just how famous Gordon was in his day. But I also have wondered if Gordon's fame in some ways oversimplified how people understood him. One of the things that's really easy to say about Gordon Parks is that he was like a Jackie Robinson figure of media. He was the first African-American staff photographer at Life magazine. He was the first black man to direct a Hollywood blockbuster motion picture, like a major studio film. But when you think that way, it's also really easy to just think of him as a hero. And the truth is, he was a deeply ambitious person who was incredibly good in a lot of different ways at what he did. And he had to be in order to get to the places where he got and to do what you're saying he did, which I think is really interesting. You were talking about how he wanted to be a voice and he wanted to change how it was that lives, and not just black lives, as you said, Deb, but to some extent to represent black lives in mass media. And that was not easy in 1948 when he joined Life magazine. It was really, really hard. And so from my perspective, what's really surprising now is that the complexification of Gordon Parks is, to me, even more enriching than the hero Gordon Parks that I have and that a lot of people have had historically.
When you go back to the Rosenwald Fund Fellowship application, that project you just described, that's what he said he wanted to do. I want to depict the Negro in all aspects around the country. That's what he wanted to do right then, and that's why he got that support. I mean, people understood then that, it might be, here was somebody who might be able to actually, make this, little thing, blossom into something much more.
Yeah.
And, and they also understood, the Rosenwald Fund administrators, they also understood that Parks was, self-taught. He wasn't really trained, and to do what he was talking about, he needed to, get to a point, where, he was really fully trained, and that's what happens in Washington. They sent him there on purpose, and I think it's like a really critical moment for him, like his, kind of transformation that takes place in Chicago. And he never examined that very closely in the memoirs or in his own, exhibitions and writing about himself. He didn't really talk about that, but.
We're going to discover it.
Sorry?
It's somewhere hidden. He's written it. We just have to find it.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Like we're discovering things, and he's written that. So he left it somewhere.
Well,
so we're
he
going to
told
find
me he
it.
threw it out.
Well, that's the beauty of all this. This placement of Gordon Parks in history is by no means over. It's continuing. For me, one of the things that's really exciting about the new tide is that there are there are levels and aspects which you guys have just seen hinted at tonight that people didn't even know they needed to know about Gordon Parks, like, for example, style and fashion, which I think is one of the most exciting stories yet to be told. And as far as I know, your essay is the first, correct me if I'm wrong, the first extensive examination of that context of Gordon's work, the context of fashion and beauty and style. Well, maybe he wrote it.
But he wrote it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he has an unpublished manuscript on fashion.
Oh, really?
And it is amazing if we could publish that. You know, it's an amazing document about how to fashion the model, how to dress, and how to consider all of these moments. That it was amazing. Like, why didn't he publish that?
That's the thing that you discovered. Paul discovered this in the Library of Congress when you were looking at the papers for Flavio, and you just, we had lunch one day, and Paul says, "Oh, there's this folder there, and it just says fashion, and it looks like it might have been an early draft of ideas for a book that he wanted to write on fashion."
Like when he did the book about portraits and the book about flash photography.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And
That was the
then,
next
so I went and looked at that. I found it and looked at it, and then I sent it to Deb.
I totally forgot.
I mean,
I
that's
was
how
too
these things
focused
work.
on this one.
We find all this stuff. He did write.
Yeah.
He did write some of that, and maybe it was something he was working on, but then he got onto something else. And
Yeah. Well, there are many, many stories to be told. But with that, I'm conscious that we don't have a lot of time left, and I wonder if anybody has any questions for Philip or for Deb. Anyone? Back there?
Hi. I'm just curious if you know anything about work he did in Canada, because a while back I saw one photograph, and I'm not sure if he was sent up there by Life magazine. It was Northern Canada, and I think the photograph was called Drugstore Cowboys. And I'm just wondering if you're familiar at all with his work in Canada?
Yes. Philip is the best person to answer this.
So in the beginning of 1944, Gordon Parks was hired to do, a long series of assignments for Standard Oil Company, New Jersey. And, we don't have time to go much into the complexity of that whole thing, but basically, Standard Oil in the early days of World War II needed to have a kind of public relations makeover because they were not in the public eye. They were doing some bad things, and so they created this whole project around art that would be a public relations campaign, and a part of that was to create photographs of how Standard Oil impacts, people's lives around the world in good ways. I mean, it really was a public relations project. And so Parks was one of a team, really talented photographers, directed by Roy Stryker, who had also directed the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information photo project. And one assignment that Parks had, I mean, he was sent to, I'm trying to think of the sequence, but he was sent to Black Diamond, Alberta, where there was oil drilling going on. And so he photographed primarily, he did some photographs of the drilling in Black Diamond around there. And this is 1945. And then he photographed the community where he made pictures like Drugstore Cowboy. And there's a number of other pictures of people who were, some of them are people who worked for the oil company, and others are just people in the community. But they're really interesting, good pictures, portraits of people. And so it was about a company called Royalite. Royalite was a Canadian oil company that was a subsidiary of Standard Oil. And then he went to, he flew north from there to Yellowknife, which at the time was a very small gold mining community in Northwest Territories. And there he photographed the gold mines, the Nijis gold mines, and then the community of people who helped to support that. And it was a lot about how the need for oil to support the mining going on in Yellowknife was, there was a great need for oil, and then the complexity of getting the oil there, because then it was very hard to even go there. You had to fly in or go by, in the right time of year. And so he photographed in Yellowknife. He photographed First Nations people on the edge of Great Slave Lake there, which was very interesting that he did that. And then he went back and he photographed the production of grain in Manitoba. Kind of on his way back, he photographed, the combines and the harvesting of grain, and then how the grain, the need for oil to fuel the combines and lubricate the combine, and then how the grain gets from the prairie to, to what's it? Trying to remember the name of where it goes to, but it's like near Detroit. I mean, it's so he photographs the railroad, taking the grain by railroad to Thunder Bay. I mean, what is it called? It was called something before, Port Arthur. Yeah, taking the grain to Port Arthur by railroad and then loading it on ships. I mean, there's very famous photographs Parks made of loading the grain ships, with the grain coming out of this big, I know they're now like, they don't do this anymore, but, the grain coming out of these big chutes, and they load it into these big ships, and then he went with them, with the ships across Lake Superior to Sarnia, I think. And
So it sounds like another book.
Yeah, no, it's, the Standard Oil
Right.
thing is another book.
Yeah.
And then, for Life, he did another project about uranium mining in Canada. I know less about that, but that was a Life assignment. But yeah, there's
it's
another.
fascinating that you asked the question,
Another
because
book.
yesterday someone asked me about that image, and we talked about just thinking about Gordon as a black man in that town,
Yeah.
and how he was accepted in these places, and Gordon, it was Jim Estrin, and he asked, why was he accepted in some of these places during the years that we know that black men were lynched or not allowed to, or forbidden, or chased out of town, which he was chased out of a number of towns in the South. But he was able to enter into a space because, and I felt that the cowboys understood, masculinity in a different way that he, and Gordon about humanity. So there was that exchange that he could look at those guys who were just kind of hanging out and appreciating their gesture, their bodies, and all of that, and able to speak to them. And so I think that exchange could helped him in terms of reading humanity in the photographs that he wanted to make about these communities. And I think it goes across all of the images that he created.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also the assignment. He was assigned to make pictures of that humanity, to humanize the oil company in some ways. I mean, it was very much about that.
But he was a black man.
No, I know.
Yeah.
And
even though it was an assignment, the strength that he had to kind of reflect on knowing who he was at that time, and creating a space a safe space for him to enter into that space.
Yeah.
That is something, you know, that I can just imagine what he was feeling and going through in terms of all of the places that he, sitting at the table with the family that, where's that foreground, middle ground, that group shot, that he's in a house of women,
Yeah.
you know, and, you know, what's happening there?
Yeah.
So he understood I mean, there's a strength that he had that he hasn't written about that either. So
You know,
that's
he had to draw on this all the way through his career. We found with the Flávio project that, in speaking to Brazilian historians, they said in 1961, and he's famous at that point, really famous, Gordon, it was incredibly unusual for a black man to come, sent by the United States, sent by the biggest magazine in the US, to photograph somebody from an indigenous background in Brazil, in the favelas, that was seen as shocking. And there was actual press coverage of Gordon being there, in part because he was a black man walking through the favelas with cameras, when the image of the favelas was very much an image of black poverty at that time. So I think he had to do this throughout his career.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
He did, and he was, you know, with the Standard Oil project and the Farm Security Administration projects, they sent him to very specific places that he could go to. He went to Canada because he could go there, whereas, you know, a big part of that project was done in Texas or in Louisiana or Wyoming, and he couldn't have gone there to make those pictures. You know, they didn't send him there, but he was incredibly good with people, with all people. And just, you know, he was able to create the kind of portraits he did, you know, in all sorts of different, very difficult environments. I think because he understood the underlying humanity of people. That's really what you're saying. So,
If,
Just a quick comment that I do think that would be an interesting research project, because I think the African Canadian history, some of us know that there is a history of blacks out west and black cowboys in those spaces. So it would have been interesting just to see, as he entered those spaces, to Deborah Willis's comment, that how did it become safe enough to be present? Because it wasn't safe for the black cowboys, even it was kind of separate, even though they were there. There's a history of African-American free blacks from Oklahoma going up into Western Canada. So that would be an interesting, there's another book, Paul.
not me.
yeah, that's really, that,
Any other questions? Back there?
Thank you. Hi, I was just wondering if there's any research as far as for how he started to make the connecting the dots to film. When I look at his work, especially the work that he did with Ralph Ellison, it comes across like a documentary to me, and I'm not sure if there's any research as far as for how he started to gravitate into film work.
Well, it's complicated. He had a few assignments for Life magazine where he visualized books, and the Ralph Ellison one is, as far as I know, the first example of that. Is that right? Or did he do one before where he actually took a book and photographed scenes from the book as promotion for the book?
I think Invisible Man was the one that.
I think that's the first
Right.
one. But
did it
Life had done stories like that before.
Right.
They did one about Native Son, and that was photographed by somebody else. It was,
Richard Wright's book.
yeah, but who's the guy who was in Chicago also photographing the black community? But he's a white photographer.
I don't know.
Wayne
Miller.
Oh, Wayne Miller.
I think it was.
Okay.
I think it was. They were photographed by Wayne Miller.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then Gordon did it again himself later when he published his novel, The Learning Tree. He ended up making a series of photographs visualizing his book. And that was certainly one of the transitions to filmmaking for him, because his very first Hollywood film was a film of The Learning Tree. his own book. It was suggested to a studio that I think it was Paramount 7 Arts. Was suggested, or Warner 7 Arts. It was suggested to them by John Cassavetes that Gordon direct his own book. But the truth is that he had made films before that, and in fact, his very first film is a kind of a hybrid documentary / children's film, or film for young people, which is in the Flávio exhibition. It was made when Gordon returned to Brazil to help the family that he had just photographed for Life magazine. He actually shot his very first film there. And he made other films, documentaries. The World of Piri Thomas was one. He was very interested in being a filmmaker, we can tell from the 1950s onward. I'm not sure exactly when, but I know that it was an ambition that he had. And in fact, when he actually left Life magazine as a staff photographer, he kept working for them on assignment, but he was no longer a staff photographer as of sometime in 1960. And one of the reasons was that he wanted to publish books, he wanted to compose music, and he wanted to be a filmmaker.
Well, all of which he did.
All of which he did. All of which he did. All right, on that note, we're going to, actually, one more question.
Hi, my question is for Deb. First of all, I'm a huge fan, and I'll see you Saturday. My question is, I guess, knowing that Gordon Parks is a self-taught photographer, a self-taught Black photographer in his time, I'm just curious about what you make of that and how you think that informed his work, and if you can imagine his work being different if he was a trained photographer from the beginning. I'm asking because I can't help but note the kind of history photography has over time and how that informs storytelling in general. So I just am curious to figure out what you think of him being a self-taught Black photographer at his time.
Well, I think that he read a lot. I know he read a lot. He, just in terms of the other question, in terms of constructing an image, he was a keen observer of places. When he walks through Chicago, you can imagine walking with him because he's taking notes. And so I think he's visualizing and constructing and drawing at the same time, not hand drawing, but visually drawing a scene and recalling. And I know that because he was, as Phil mentioned, he worked with a lot of artists while he was in Chicago, and it reflected on the experiences that he wanted to tell. I think it has also to do with his wife, who was a fashion designer. And I think that having that opportunity to see, to have a woman who's close to him and looking at clothing in a certain way, looking at dresses, he's observing a lot. And then I think that was the most important part of not being, quote, trained by someone, but he was just self-taught in a way that he could look at light, create a way to make the light work the way he wanted it to work for him. And he wrote a book about lighting. He wrote a book about portraiture based on his own experiences. And I think that really helped him in major ways. And when he worked with Roy Stryker, it was about editing. How do you edit this image? But I think when he was constructing an image, it was him, and he was, focused on telling that story.
I think, he was self-taught. There's a little thing in an early article that describes his studio in St. Paul, and it says that his studio was in the kitchen, which he was allowed to use when his wife would permit it, and his lights were made from tin cans. So he didn't have money to have a photo studio. He created it, and he taught himself how to do all of that stuff, with some guidance from friend. And then when he went to Washington, it was with the idea that he would learn the technique of lighting, of flash, of large camera photography, of medium format photography really well. And that's what he did there, And you can see the early photographs, he's kind of still struggling with lighting. And then he gets it, and people are helping him. So he's self-taught, but he figured it out based on, what you would have to do to, by reading manuals, by reading books, looking at magazines, and then he was dropped into the middle of what was then probably, one of the premier kind of photo production agencies in the world, the Foreign Security Administration.
Foreign Security,
Yeah, and they taught him.
But I think Chicago taught him also. I think
absolutely.
that was a central
Yeah.
place for him, where he, at the South Side Community Arts Center, the idea of photographing and different experiences in that area, he grew from that as well.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Philip Brookman, Deb Willis. And thank you as well to Band, our co-presenters. I urge all of you to keep an eye out for the book that they have completed, which will be out soon, The New Tide. Thank you.